and welcome to What Does the Bible Say? We appreciate you very much for tuning in with us. I hope that you're at home, have your Bible, pen and pad ready, and if you have anyone that is in need of learning what does the Bible say about salvation and what is required of man in the eyes of God so as to be redeemed, this is the show that you want them to be tuned in on. Any individuals that are in the Baptist churches or practically any denomination that's out there that's following man-made doctrines and man-made teachings, we want them to be tuned in as well. This information is certainly geared towards those that are outside of the Lord's body, but we realize that a lot of brethren, a lot of people that are inside the Lord's body are gaining a lot of encouragement from the material that's being put forth. First principle, the basic fundamental materials that are dealing with how to be a Christian, how to identify a Christian, where's a Christian to be, how, just all these type of things. So we appreciate all of you very much for contacting us. Had brethren from Massachusetts get in contact with me on Friday, wanting to just send a quick message of encouragement, letting us know that they appreciate the broadcast and they look forward to every time that What Does the Bible Say is on. So we appreciate them for tuning in, and thank you to all of those that will be listening to us tomorrow. We appreciate your viewership as well. Come out and visit with us. 823 Starland Avenue, 120 American Legion Boulevard, there in Danville, Virginia. Tonight we want to start with a clip from our my favorite people from Asheville, North Carolina. Some might wonder, why in the world do you still listen to these two guys? Hey, I love these guys. And if I do not have anything else better to do, on Friday, I'm watching Andrew Sluter and Randy Keener. If nothing else, like one of the broadcasts that shows that Andrew and Randy did, he said, if nothing else, people just ought to watch this for the comedic relief. He said, this is comedy gold. They're some pretty funny guys, and especially when it comes to Bible stuff, witty Bible stuff. I enjoy that type of stuff. So if you're a person, and on top of that, if you're a person that's really wanting to continuously hear, okay, what are these guys saying? What is it? What are their positions? And especially in listening to them on a continuous basis, you're going to be able to hear all the ways that their positions continue to evolve. I went back, I found a broadcast that they did from October of last year, and somebody raised a question about Romans chapter 4, which another broadcast that I had found, somebody else, and actually somebody that's not friendly to them, raised a question on their position about Romans chapter 4, and how is it the case that you can look at Romans chapter 4 where it says that Abraham was justified by faith, when yet they believe that there still had to be works that went along with Abraham's faith. A lot of individuals within the Baptist religion and other denominations as well, they would look at that and say, well, hey, y'all have missed the mark. And in fact, that's where individuals like other people inside of the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, Tanner Adams over there in Illinois, he would disagree with these two gentlemen about Romans chapter 4, where Andrew and Randy would say, well, yeah, there were works that had to go along with what Abraham was doing, but what was it that justified him? It was his faith. But the works were needed in order to have proper biblical faith. And really, when you get down to it, it is just that simple. You're not needing to just completely separate and dissect Abraham's labor, Abraham's work from his faith. And that's the type of thing, or that's the line of subject matter that we're going to deal with tonight, not from Romans chapter 4. But as you can see on the screen with the clip that we have, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21. Somebody raises the question on their Backwoods Bible broadcast, and this is back a while. I'm thinking this is, this is back during the Phil Kid stuff, so this isn't that far back, but it is after the debate and everything that took place with Caleb. So let's listen to this clip and we'll get the ball rolling.
Guys, we got 55 years. Y'all got to start asking some questions. This is literally the only question here, and then we're done. If y'all don't put some questions on,
we're just going to start calling people names.
Yeah, we're just going to start. Oh, don't say that, because then they'll be like, nobody type anything.
That is true.
What is your take?
This is your fault. This is your fault. This is all your fault. I'm furious about it.
What's your take on 1 Peter 3:21?
I don't even know what 1 Peter 3:21 is.
It's not about the spirits of prison. Or no, it's about baptism. It's about baptism. It's about being baptized. Well, it says the like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay. What do you think that means, Brent? Well, I believe it means it's good to be baptized, and that it does nothing as far as taking away your sin. I agree with you. It doesn't wash away the filth of the flesh. You know what the filth of the flesh is, don't you? Mm-hmm. You talked about it before. Yeah, 2 Corinthians 7:1 says the filth of the flesh is sins. It's sins. And the like figure doth now also save us. Yeah. So, it's a figure. You know, all the modern versions take the word figure out. And the corrupt 1960s. Spanish Bible takes the word figure out. Yeah, it sure does. And you're left with baptism doth also now save us. Yeah. And what you going to do with the Catholic then? Mm-hmm. You're going to have to baptize them. And what I tell people is you know, it's not the putting away the filth of the flesh. It's not people getting baptized to put away sin, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. Well, notice the only cross-reference to the conscience being cleansed or anything like that is Hebrews 9:14. And it's the blood of Christ, purging the conscience from dead works. So baptism is the answer of a good conscience. So that you get baptized to answer the good conscience. The conscience is already clean by the time you get into the baptismal waters. But according to the Church of Christ, that doesn't happen, or the Catholic Church, or whatever of the water dogs you want to talk about. So your conscience is already clear by the time you get in the waters.
So as I mentioned, you got a bit of disagreement going on with the Independent Fundamental Baptist group, but this seems to be a common theme and a common thread that goes, beyond denominational borders. Within the Baptist realm, Pentecostal realm, Apostolic realm, whatever it may be the case, and here's an example of it.
To be baptized in order to be saved and go to heaven?
Yes, I believe you need to be baptized in the Word of God.
Oh,
Yes, sir.
now I'm talking about,
Yes, sir.
like in the Bible, the eunuch.
Yes, sir.
Went-
That's it. Yeah.
Okay,
I
went-
believe you need
yeah.
to be baptized.
in order to go to heaven.
Yes, sir.
You cannot go to
The
heaven.
Word of God. Yes, sir.
All
I
right.
believe you got to have.
So
the
what
Word of
about
God.
water
There's
baptism?
three that bear record in heaven: Father, Word, and Holy Spirit.
Do I need to be baptized in water to go to heaven?
Water is an outwater symbol. That's right. Water is outwater symbol. And if you are
Where does the
saved,
Bible-
if
Okay.
you're saved, why would you be ashamed to let the world know you baptized?
So-
That's a symbol.
So you were saved before you were baptized?
Yeah, you gotta be a believer.
Okay, you were saved before you were baptized?
A believer.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe you should be a believer.
Okay, so being a believer before baptism.
Baptize you in the Holy Ghost and the Word. So
Okay.
you want to be baptized.
Yeah.
That only water baptism is an outward symbol, showing just like you might have a pen on it. That's a symbol.
Yes, sir.
That's what that is.
Okay.
You with me?
Where does the Bible say that? Where,
He told John the Baptist something.
but where does he say that it's an outward symbol of an inward salvation? Where does
I
the
didn't say outward symbol for our salvation. It's just an outward symbol. It's a
of
symbol.
what?
Oh, that you've been baptized.
So I'm being baptized to symbolize that I'm being baptized.
No. I'm about to let you know.
Okay.
You're going to have.
Yes, sir.
But you know it's three that the scripture tell you put down, right? What is it about?
The water?
And it's-
Well, in 1 Peter 3:21, he says,
No, I'm talking about what John said.
I,
That bear record.
yeah.
One bear record in earth and some bear record in heaven.
Okay, so I'm wanting to quote Peter. Don't you think Peter and John agree with each other?
Yeah, in some
Oh,
respects.
in some respects, not all respects.
In the chamber, they may be talking about different subjects.
So I'm talking about in 1 Peter 3:21, he said the like figure even doth now baptism also save us. And he had just talked about before where he said that 8 souls were saved by water.
Right.
And now he says after that, the like figure, water, we are all baptized, doth now save us.
Right.
So at that point, he's saying that's our salvation.
Baptism.
Yes, sir, in the blood of Christ, through water baptism. Okay, okay, and that's how you're going to be saved?
You're going to be saved by Jesus Christ.
I agree.
If you accept Him as your Lord and Savior.
Right.
That's what I believe.
But are you saved
Say,
before?
whosoever call on the name of Jesus shall be what? Whosoever shall call on the
Yes.
name of the Lord shall be saved.
But how do you call on the name of the Lord?
You say Jesus, call.
How do you do that?
That's called the name. Jesus! It's simple.
Okay.
Call it. And he'll answer too.
Okay, so calling on the name of the Lord is simply calling out Jesus.
Well, hey, look, some people call on telephone. Some people call
Yeah.
by call.
Yeah.
But the scripture says call.
And that's the way you're saved. Calling on the name of the
It
Lord.
said in your heart. Leave your heart. Confess. Leave your heart.
Yes.
Confess. Call in your heart.
Mhm.
And you call on the name of the Lord Jesus Christ.
So a lot of gymnastics going on in those two clips. With Andrew and Randy, we're going to deal mainly with Andrew and Randy, but I just want to lay this clip alongside of it just to show, hey, it's not just Andrew and Randy. Everyone is trying to pin down water baptism as being, as Mr. Keene was saying, it's an outward symbol. Andrew and Randy, they wanted to hone in on the word figure, the like figure. Andrew kept saying over and over again, it's a figure, it's a figure. Okay, a figure of what? What is the actual thing that it is going to be a figure of? Or what is the actual thing? If you got something with a figure, it's got to be fulfilling something else. What is the other thing? They don't have anything to actually take the place of what this is a figure of. Now, when we're considering, and one of the things that they try to do, I know that Andrew used this illustration. Many people have tried to use it. They try to use, he makes the statement, I couldn't find the clip, but he's made the statement of, well, it's just like a wedding ring. It's a symbol that, okay, you belong to somebody else. But the problem is that you do not find that type of illustration being used about water baptism. And even when we're looking at this word figure is not like this, it's not the same word as symbol. It's an entirely different word. Now, I know Andrew and Randy don't like going back to the Greek for anything. They just like sticking with the English. But even when you're considering that it says this is the like figure, what is the like figure? It's that which is mentioned in the previous verses. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20. What was it that was being discussed before we got into this figure? What is it just being like? 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20. Which sometime were disobedient when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. They go through this whole illustration how that, look at what's happening. The like figure where even unto baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God. They're discussing, well, it's not taking away the sin, the sins on your flesh. Listen, we're not looking for that anyways. And besides, sin does not go on your flesh. Now, I can sin with my flesh, but the sins that I commit that are done by my flesh, they affect my inward man. They affect my soul. That's what I'm trying to get cleansed. And notice how the figure goes. This word figure is actually can be translated as antitype. The antitype whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. What's the type? The antitype. The type is back here with Noah and the flood. 8 souls were saved by water. Peter says this is not a salvation just purely of their flesh. This is a saving of their souls. And how was it done? Done by water. Now, are we going to go to the extreme like our denominational friends do and just start trying to pinpoint these one elements and say, okay, that's the thing that saved them by themselves? By itself, rather. No. They're saved by water, but what else was involved? The ark was there. Faith was there, Hebrews chapter 11. But what else was also there? Genesis chapter 6, grace. God's grace was there. So there you have grace, faith, works, water. All of that encapsulated with what Noah was doing. And that's just taking all the scriptures on the subject and laying them side by side and finding out here's what all was going on during that time frame. What then does Peter move into? He moves away from what happened there in the past and he lays on top of it the like figure. That word figure, as we mentioned, is not in any way associated with some outward showing, some outward sign of what's taking place on the inside. That's not how this word actually works. Type, antitype. Has to be something before. This is actually a casting of the shadow, or the thing that's casting the shadow back on what it was that's the like figure. When we're viewing these, and even when we're viewing these figures, and that's where we wanted to go this evening. just because, let's grant them, let's just say, now like I mentioned, their illustration of wedding rings, figure, it's a symbol. That's not what that word is, but let's just grant them that argument for the sake of it. Just because it's a symbol, does that then mean that it's not required for salvation? Let's like I said, let's just give it to them. Okay, it's a symbol. But even if it's just a symbol, can you still then come behind and say, well, since it's a symbol and since it's a figure, it's actually not needed for salvation? Now, what we're going to do this evening, we're going to go back to the Old Testament. In Romans chapter 15 verse 4, and how that in fact these things were written aforetime, were written for our learning. We're going to go back and we're going to learn from some other symbols. Now the word that's actually used under the Old Testament, or not under the Old Testament, but during the time frame of the patriarchs for sure, you have the word token being used. Figure, symbol, token. When Mr. Keene was talking to Caleb, Caleb was wearing a lapel pin, and he said it's a lot like that pin that you got there. You know, it's a sign. It's a showing forth of, okay, this is, like if it was a part of a certain group or a club or what have you, it shows to people, okay, I'm a part of that group, and they're just simply saying, okay, that's what baptism is. Baptism is just a showing that I belong to this group. Now, if you could find a verse that actually laid it out that way, then we would take it that way. But you're not going to find it. But even as we consider tokens, symbols, figures, if you will, under the Old Testament, let's put another biblical term for it with it, examples. The word example is actually connected. It is a segment of the other word where you have figure. Figure is actually two Greek words being put together. Example is one of those Greek words that's found inside of the word figure. So when you're thinking about a token, let's just read about some Old Testament tokens, and we'll raise the question. Just because it's a token, does that then make it unnecessary to what it is that God is describing? The first place that you find this word token is in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 7. This is dealing with Abram. His name has not been changed to Abraham yet, or rather it has been changed to Abraham. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee, thy seed after thee and their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee. And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore, thou and thy seed after thee and their generations. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. Now what's the significance of circumcision? And ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. Now let's just lay this out. Here's Abraham, and he's being told, I'm establishing a covenant. You and I are going to enter into covenant together. But in fact, if you are going to enter into covenant with me, there's something you're going to have to do first. Now, when we look at this illustration and we're looking at this term, here's the term that they all like to play around with. This word token is Hebrew. It can also be translated as a flag, a beacon, a monument, omen, prodigy, evidence, a mark, a miracle, an ensign, or just simply a token. Okay, it's a flag. It's a pin, it's a beacon that you wear, showing to people, hey, this is who I'm connected with. This is who my allegiance is to. But even with that type of definition, even with that type of background on the word, does that then alleviate any responsibility or any role, any fixture that circumcision actually plays in what it is that God is establishing? Just because it's a token, just because it's a symbol, do we then just get to scoff at it and just say, well, it's not really needed? Romans chapter 4, Abraham believed and it was counted in him to righteousness. But look at what God is saying. God is saying, we're going to enter into covenant together, but if you're going to come into covenant with me, you've got to do this first. Individuals under our time frame which we are right now, as we're going through this information, this is rather childish. Even if you're just halfway paying attention, you'll be able to answer these questions. When was one under covenant? When they believed, or when they actually took on the token. When they were involved in the figure, in the thing that God had given to them and said, hey, you do this, this brings you into covenant. When is one brought under covenant? Before or after the token? Before or after the symbol? Now, as I said, these words that they're trying to use for baptism, water baptism under the New Testament system, you're not going to find it like this. It's not laid out like this. Baptism is not a symbol, a figure of anything that has already taken place. It is the place where salvation is being acquired. And it has nothing to do with the water. I mean, if you just think about this, what does circumcising every male child, every male person in your house, what spiritual significance does that actually hold? I mean, really, just stop and think about that. Why are we needing to do this? That's just the stipulation. That is just the requirement that God has set out for Abraham and the people that are with him. If you're wanting to receive these blessings, what are you needing to do? Circumcise. Now, could Abraham at this juncture look at God and say, well, okay, God, I believe you, but I'm not going to circumcise? You know, that's just a token. That's just a symbol of what's already happened. Has he been brought into covenant at this point where God says, okay, circumcise, and that'll be a token? Oh, Abraham is already in covenant with God. No. He has not done what it is that God said he must do. And as we're considering these things and we're looking at it, notice this: and he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations, he that is born in the house. We drop down to verse 12, chapter 17. Or bought with money, or of any stranger which is not of thy seed, he that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. And the uncircumcised man child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. Now, if there is no judgment that's going to be passed on the part of God upon those that believe, the denominational world says, hey, all you have to do is believe, and you're brought into covenant with God. That's not what God says here. God says, he warns Abraham, Abraham, if you stay in your uncircumcision after I have told you to circumcise, what's going to happen to you? That soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. You're not going to receive these blessings that I promised to you. Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15, and even again here in Genesis chapter 17, these promises are being restated to Abraham. Then he's going to bring forth seed. That seed's going to grow into a mighty nation. And out of that seed, all nations of the earth, they're going to go and gain the land, the promised land that will be given to them. And out of his seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Those are the blessings that are coming from God. But how are they being disposed? How are they being given to Abraham? Not simply by faith alone. Right here, Abraham is being brought further into covenant with God, and it's based upon circumcision, a token, God says. That does not mean that it's not necessary. That Abraham could just simply say, hey, I'm already in this. I'm not going to do that. And really, I said it brings him further into covenant. That's what's interesting about this. Was Abraham in covenant with God before circumcision? Now, this is the kind of games that individuals in the denominational realm will try to play when Tanner Adams and I were discussing about Noah building the ark. Noah was in a saved position before Genesis chapter 6. Noah believed God, he worshiped God, and he was following after God. So when God steps in and decides and says he's going to bring judgment on the world and destroy the world, he's going to give grace to Noah in that he's going to allow his family to be able to escape. If Noah had died before the flood came, take for example Noah's family, Melchizedek. If Noah had died like Melchizedek and his forefathers before him, he would have gone on to paradise. But God steps in and He gives regulation to Noah and says, Noah, I'm sending this destruction on the earth. You build an ark. Build an ark, save your house, and as Peter says, it'll be the saving of your souls. Just because he was in a saved position with God before that, if he had rejected what God had said, what would have happened to him? And even Tanner Adams answered this honestly and correctly. He would have died just like everybody else. Well, why would that be the case? They died because of wickedness and unrighteousness. So you would have Noah dying with the wicked. And Abraham even addresses that in Genesis chapter 19. He asked God, when God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, wilt thou destroy the righteous with the wicked? Will not the judge of all the earth do right or do what's right? If Noah was always going to be a saved individual, a righteous man, then the righteous are not going to die with the wicked. So you have these characters and what's going on during this time frame. It's a token, but it's still involved. It's still necessary. It's still a crucial part. Either you do it, being brought into covenant, or you do not do it and you're cut off from the earth. Abraham was already in covenant with God. Genesis 15, 17. We were in Genesis 17. Genesis 17, now we're back in Genesis 15. Look what you have being said. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between these places. In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Abram at this point, Abram is already in covenant relationship with God. But we get over to Genesis chapter 17, and what is God saying? Your name is being changed to Abraham. I'm establishing a covenant with you. With this, or it's the same covenant, but what do you have God adding to it? God adds to this covenant the token of circumcision. Now, the way the mindset goes today, Abraham could have stared God in the face and said, God, I'm already in covenant with you. I do not need the token. I'm already in covenant. You and I are on the same page. He's already said, has he not? Genesis chapter, thought I had it in here, Genesis chapter 15 and verse 6. What's already been said about Abram? And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Abram is a righteous man. He's already in covenant with God. And God comes along and He adds circumcision to the equation. What's a person? Oh, it was right there on the screen. Sorry about that. Didn't realize it was there. Could Abraham make this statement towards God? God, I've already trusted in you. I've already believed in you, and you've already said that I'm righteous. I do not need circumcision. I believe you, so I'm okay. Is that how this operates? Is that how we're to take the things that God has given to us as requirements so as to come into covenant with Him? If God says this thing is needed in order for relationship, fellowship, covenant to take place, then what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to do what He says so as to come into covenant with Him. He told Abraham, this is the token. Really, if you get down to it, this is what gets you into where you're needing to be with me. Yeah, you're righteous up to this point, but now I'm adding this. Either you do it or you reject it. If you do it, you'll receive blessing. If you reject it, what happens? They shall be cut off from His people. Does the token really matter? Andrew Sluter, Randy Keener, they're all looking at water baptism. It's just a figure. It's just a figure. It's not necessary. It's just a figure of something that's already happened. Well, let's look at this figure. Let's look at this token. Was there ever a situation to where, you know what, this token almost had somebody cut off? What is God saying when He says that soul? Now notice there, we're looking at something that is physical, circumcision of the flesh, but what does it have a bearing on? It has a bearing on an individual soul. Look at this. Here's Exodus chapter 4 and verse 24. God told Abraham, if you do not circumcise, that soul shall be cut off. Now we're over in the book of Exodus. And it came to pass, by the way, in the end, this is Moses with his family going back to Egypt, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. So he let him go. Then she said, a bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. Oh, it's just a token. It's just a symbol of what's already taken place. Abraham believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness. He was justified by faith. He was in a covenant relationship because of his faith, his belief. I don't think so. If Abraham had rejected God's token, God's no, I keep wanting to say example. God's command, I don't know why that word couldn't come to me. God's command of circumcision, he would not be in covenant. And now we have a clear illustration where God is in fact ready to kill a man because someone was not circumcised. Now let's run through this. Did Moses believe God? Was he a believer? Well, he'd already witnessed the burning bush. The Lord speaking to him from a burning bush, and the bush did not burn up. He saw the rod in his hand be thrown down, turn into a serpent, picking it back up, and it turned back into a rod. His hand made leprous, and then when he put it into his bosom and pulled it back out, it was healed again. He's had this communication, this conversation with God, and he tries to fight with God about going back and delivering the people, and finally God, he humbles himself and he submits to what God has said, and he's on his way back to Egypt to do what God said. Is all of this fitting the equation? Is Moses a believer? Is he obeying? Yes, he is. Here is a believer, and God was ready to cut off the soul that's uncircumcised because someone was not under the token. Like I said, baptism is not a symbol. But if we grant them the argument, it still does not work in their equation. You cannot take something that God has made a requirement. This is what you do. Even if He does call it a token, you cannot take it and then set it to the side as though it's not necessary. When God says a thing is necessary, it's necessary. And it's necessary for the reasons that He says that it's necessary. Circumcision was so as to bring them into covenant. What does baptism do for us today? It is for the remission of sins. In order to receive, in order to obtain. Not because something had already been gotten. But that's what all of these individuals are trying to do. That really is a belittling, just striking down at what it is that God's Word actually said. God said, you need the token to be in covenant. Okay, then I don't get to just set it aside and just simply say, okay, well, it's just a symbol of what's already happened. No, this is the juncture, this is the point. Now here's the thing. Did circumcision itself bring them into covenant? No. God is the one that brought them into covenant together. But the only way God is going to bring a person into covenant with Him is if they keep His commandments. Abraham did it, and we see an event under the Old Testament where Moses neglected it with one of his children. Is that big of a deal? Oh, it was big enough to where God was ready to strike him down, take him out of the way. How can a person then look at baptism today and say, well, if you're not baptized, you'll be okay? You don't get to disregard God's tokens like that. When is one in covenant? Before circumcision? After circumcision? When was Abraham brought into covenant? Well, he was in covenant before. But what if he had rejected what God said? He would have been cut off because he had broken God's covenant. It's just that simple. And then to look at Abraham's life and to say, there's no works, he was just simply justified by his faith, is a dishonest look, is a dishonest study going through of what the Bible actually teaches. Now, we've got the phone lines open. Tanner Adams is already messaging me on Facebook. He can call in and try to go round and round on this again, but you cannot actually go back to this Old Testament system and neglect what it is that's actually happening here. I mean, if we're, I see the lines blinking. I'm coming to you just a moment. Let me finish this thought. Let's just go through this on the other side of it. What if Abraham had simply done this, but he didn't have faith that God was actually going to do what he said he would do? Okay, God, I'm going to do what you say, but I don't see what this has to do with anything. I don't really believe. I'm not trusting in what it is you've actually said. What is that? Those are dead works. That's works without faith. That doesn't get you in. But his faith without his works wasn't going to get him in either. The two have got to go together. Otherwise, you're going to end up like Moses on the other side of the circumcision situation, and God's going to be ready to kill you. Now, notice, I don't know where the caller went. If they want to call back in, we'll get to them. Here's Acts chapter. No, notice what we have under the New Testament system. Here's Acts chapter 15, and look at the shift that we're actually having take place. Here's Acts chapter 15, and we have this council going on in Jerusalem, and look at what it's over. Certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. What did the Jews understand about circumcision? When was a person saved during the time frame that this was in fact a regulation? Now, when we're looking at this, we need to be careful because we're not needing to get so wrapped up in what it was they were getting wrapped up in. They are simply just looking at the act of circumcision by itself. They are just simply looking at the work. Okay, we'll be circumcised. Circumcised will save us. No, God will save you because you're coming into covenant. But even they realized, hey, Abraham needed to obey so as to be brought into covenant. They're arguing over circumcision. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. So we'll come back to this after we deal with this call. Good evening, caller. What's the Bible say?
Hey, what's up, man? This is Tanner from Good News Baptist.
Yeah, we know who you are. What's your question?
Yeah, question about 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21.
Okay.
The Bible says, you believe that baptism is the answer of a good conscience towards God, right?
In fact, yes. If a person is wanting to have a good conscience towards God, they need to obey.
So, look what it says, though. It said it is the answer of a good conscience towards God.
Okay.
Not the answer for.
Okay. When is the conscience made a good conscience?
Well, according to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 14, and Hebrews chapter 10, verse 1 through 3, it's when the blood is applied. When
is the conscience made good?
When the blood is applied, when you have faith in Jesus Christ.
Okay, now you add 1 Peter 3:21 to that. What else is in the equation of a good conscience?
Say that again.
Add into, don't try to just act like they're different. Add into 1 Peter 3:21 with Hebrews chapter 9, and we're going to get there. We're going to get there tonight. What else is involved with the answer of a good conscience?
I guess I'm not understanding. The good conscience comes when the blood is applied.
Peter says
the answer of that good conscience is you get baptized. That's exactly what 1 Peter 3:21 is saying.
That is not what 1 Peter 3:21 is saying. 1 Peter 3:21 is saying baptism is, notice here, it's not the putting away of the flesh, right?
Yeah, and what does that mean?
All right, it's not, baptism is not the putting away of the flesh, but baptism is the answer of a good conscience toward God. When does a person have a good conscience? When they've done what God says, or before they do what God says?
comes when you do what God says, of course.
Okay, so when does the good conscience come? Before or after baptism?
Before baptism.
No,
because
you almost
the
answered it.
answer of a
You
good
almost
conscience.
answered it.
Baptism is the answer of this good conscience.
Okay, well let's go.
What it's saying.
All right, let's go back to Abraham. When did he have a good conscience before God? Before circumcision, after circumcision?
Before, because he was counted righteous in Genesis 15, verse 6.
Okay, so then when the command came in Genesis chapter 17 for him to be circumcised, could he have a good conscience? Could he have a good conscience? Could he have a good conscience before God and disobey what God said?
I never said you could do that, man. I never once said that.
Well then don't go back to Genesis chapter 15.
In covenant with God.
Don't go back to Genesis 15. Deal with Genesis 17.
Was the picture.
Deal with Genesis 17. Could he have a good conscience before circumcision or after circumcision?
He had it before circumcision. He was saved before circumcision.
Now, Tanner.
So he obviously had a good conscience
Mr. Adams,
before he was circumcised.
Mr. Adams, I've already dealt with that. Deal with the question. Genesis 17, God gives a command.
Okay.
Could he keep a good conscience and ignore what God's command was?
Keep? You said keep?
Could he keep a good conscience and ignore what God said?
No, and I never once said
Okay.
you could have a good conscience without doing what God said.
Okay. Now align that over 1 Peter 3:21. When
if
does
you don't obey God in baptism, you're going to have a bad conscience. I don't agree with you there. But it's the answer of a good conscience.
No,
there is a good conscience,
that is a
the answer of
disagreement
that
with
is
me.
You get baptized.
But that is a disagreement with me because that's not what the verse says. The verse does not say a good conscience comes before baptism. A good conscience comes after baptism.
That's not according to Peter, man.
That
it's
is.
Of. The of has to be there. The of has to be there. It's the answer of.
But what is the
Okay,
it?
Not for, but it's of a good conscience. Meaning the good conscience is there. And the answer of that good conscience is being baptized. If you don't get baptized, of course you're not going to have a good conscience towards God after that. You're not obeying God.
So you
If you don't
can.
obey God, you're not going to have a good conscience.
So, Mr. Adams, you can have a good conscience while not having a good conscience.
You're not understanding me.
I understand that's a contradiction. That's a contradiction within your illustration. You said you can have a good conscience but you have a good conscience before you actually are able to have a good conscience. That doesn't make any sense.
No, the Bible says that baptism is the answer of a good conscience.
That's right. Baptism is the answer. Baptism is the answer of a good conscience.
Of a good conscience towards God.
That's right.
Conscience has to be there.
That's right. Conscience has to be there. But it says within this verse, what is it that is the answer of a good conscience?
Water baptism.
Okay. So how then are you going to... Okay, go ahead.
Meaning the good conscience was already there. That's my only point I'm trying to make. Is that the good conscience is already there because it's the answer of a good conscience.
You cannot
have a good conscience unless the blood is applied, my friend.
If you
That's
have...
what initially clears your conscience.
If you have a good conscience, then why do I need to have the answer of a good conscience? My conscience is already good.
Because we're commanded to be baptized. That's the first step of obedience after salvation.
What difference does that make? My conscience is already good.
Because if you don't follow in obedience, my friend, you're not gonna be in fellowship with God. You're not gonna have a good conscience. That can happen to Christians.
So, baptism is what brings me into fellowship, not my faith.
Your faith does, but if you walk in sin, if you walk in disobedience to God, we're going to break that fellowship. That's exactly what happens. That's what 1 John chapter 1 says.
Okay, so my faith brings me into fellowship, but I actually am not in fellowship until I do what this says. So am I in fellowship or am I not in fellowship?
I said a Christian can break fellowship with God if they disobey God. Yes, that is possible for a Christian.
But is a person actually a Christian before they have done what's required for a good conscience?
Well, the requirement to get a good conscience is to obey the gospel. And obeying the gospel is believing the gospel. That's Romans chapter 10, verse 16.
Okay, so I have a good conscience, but really I don't have a good
But
conscience.
if you don't obey God after salvation, you're not going to have a good conscience towards God. That's obvious stuff. That's the milk of the word, my friend. That's called walking in. That's abiding in truth. That's walking in the Spirit.
So in fact,
Thank
I do
God.
not have. So in fact, I do not have a good conscience until this point.
It's the answer of a good conscience, my friend. You're not hearing. You're not seeing this.
I am hearing what you're saying. What you're saying is a huge contradiction. How can I have a good conscience?
It's
But
theology, my friend.
if
People who actually believe what the Bible says, it's not a contradiction.
if I have a good conscience before God before I do this, then what bearing does this have on my good conscience? I already have a good conscience. That doesn't even make any sense.
I just told you, a Christian, if he does not obey God, will not have a good conscience towards God.
So does that mean that a Christian is lost?
No, absolutely not. That's why you confess your sins. That He is faithful and just to forgive you every sin and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Okay?
So the importance of a good conscience is so that I can be in fellowship with God, but I can then have a bad conscience and continue to stay in fellowship with God to where I can actually still be saved.
Yes, absolutely.
So what?
Once you're saved, you're always saved.
So then okay, I don't have to be baptized.
You don't exactly. You don't have to be baptized.
So then
But you're not gonna
why?
You're not going to have a good conscience towards God.
What
and
difference does that make?
fellowship with God.
Why are you even calling in to argue with me about a good conscience when even what you're arguing does not even matter?
Because the point still stands, my friend. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21 says baptism is the answer of a good conscience.
That's right. Baptism.
Not for a good conscience, my friend. Don't change the Bible.
Baptism.
It's the answer of a good conscience, not for a good conscience.
Baptism itself is the answer of a good conscience towards God. I have to do that so as to have a good conscience.
That's not what 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21 is saying, my friend.
That is, that's what you have actually said yourself. That's exactly what you said yourself.
It's of. Not for, it's of.
You have already said that in order to have my conscience be good with God, I have to be baptized.
That's after salvation, my friend.
No, I mean that.
Saved first, and the first step of obedience is salvation.
How can I
The answer
have?
of a good conscience.
How can I have a good conscience before I have fulfilled what it is that God says I need to do to have a good conscience? You have me having a good conscience before Peter even says I have a good conscience.
It's the answer of a good conscience. Are you not? You can't see that?
Mr. Adams, Mr. Adams, I see what you're saying, but it does not line up when you follow it through.
But it does.
No, it
Don't
doesn't.
follow up with your theology. But with
So-
the Bible, it actually does. It is. That is what the Bible teaches.
Okay, so you say, by faith, I have a good conscience.
Yes.
But yet I get over here 1 Peter 3:21, and then I'm being told, well, if you're wanting to have a good conscience with God, then you need to be baptized.
Where does it say that at?
That's what you said.
I did not say that.
You did.
I said it 10 times. It's the answer of a good conscience, not for a good conscience.
Okay, so I already have a good conscience. I don't have to do this.
The answer of your good conscience is to be baptized, be water baptized.
So I already have a good conscience. I don't have to do this.
I never once said someone doesn't have to be baptized. You don't have to be baptized to be saved. But God does command us to be baptized. It's the first step of obedience after salvation.
Now, is that the case that you have right here where it says that, okay, this is a part of having a good conscience?
No, it says it's the answer of a good conscience. A good conscience is already there.
No, this is the answer of a good conscience that I'm trying to receive this. It says a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. This is not something that has already been obtained. This is what is needing to be obtained.
It's of, not for. You're changing the Bible.
The answer of a good conscience.
The
What
of has
is?
to be there. To be the answer of something, the of has to be there.
Say that again.
But I said it's the answer of a good conscience. The of has to be there.
Okay, so if I'm wanting to have a good,
something, the of has to be there first.
no, in
There is
fact,
no answer.
in fact, it's saying this is the answer of a good conscience. If I'm wanting to have a good conscience, what must I do according to 1 Peter 3:21?
It doesn't say. It's the answer of meaning that good conscience is already there.
No,
That's
baptism.
simple grammar.
Baptism equals what?
What?
Baptism equals what in this equation?
Baptism equals the answer of a good conscience towards God.
Okay, so
That's what I first asked you. Baptism is the answer of a good conscience towards God.
so if I, according to 1 Peter 3:1, if I'm wanting to have a good conscience toward God, what is needed in the equation?
It already says that a good conscience is there. I mean, I guess you're not going to see that, but it's very clear. It's the answer of,
So I can
not for.
so I can disobey God and still have a good conscience.
I just answered that. Christians, if they do not obey God, first step of obedience is salvation. I mean, is baptism. The first step of obedience after salvation is baptism. If they don't do that, obviously they're not going to have a good conscience towards God.
So then they're not going to be saved then. How can you be saved and not have a good conscience?
I just told you, the blood is what clears our conscience. The blood is applied, and the answer of that good conscience is baptism. If you don't obey God, the first step of obedience, then obviously you're not going to retain that good conscience because you're obeying God.
So
You'll be saved.
but here's the thing.
You won't be in full fellowship. You won't be walking in the Spirit. You won't be doing a lot of stuff.
So if you're not walking in the Spirit, how can you be saved?
Because it's a command. It's not automatic. He said walk in the Spirit is a command.
Okay, but Romans chapter
Not
8,
automatic.
Romans chapter 8 says, if you walk after the flesh, what about that?
There's carnal Christians and there's fleshly Christians
No.
and there's spiritual Christians.
For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die. But if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live.
Yeah, it's talking about physical. Yeah, absolutely.
No, that's not physical. Notice, you're not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if so be that in the Spirit God dwell in you. Now, if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. If I'm out here walking in the world, not walking in the Spirit, I don't belong to Christ. So you see, you're still trying to have it both ways.
So you don't think a Christian can be carnal? You don't think there's no such thing as a carnal Christian?
What does Paul say about those that are walking after the flesh, those that would be carnal?
What did Paul say about himself in the chapter right before that?
I want to deal
We
with
know that
this.
the world is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. That's present tense. He said, I am carnal, sold under sin.
You are walking after the flesh. You're none of his. So how can a person walk in the flesh, not walking in the Spirit, and then still have a good conscience toward God?
I didn't say you could.
Neither does Paul.
I did not say you can walk in the flesh. I did not say you can walk in the flesh and have a good conscience towards
Actually,
God.
you did, because
I just said
no.
that Christians, if they don't obey God, they're not going to have that good conscience towards God. You're going to be a carnal Christian.
All right, carnal Christian, walking in the flesh, and what does that mean? You have not the Spirit of Christ, you are none of his. So you can't be walking in the flesh, having a bad conscience, and still be trying to claim Christ as your own, can you?
I just think you're twisting what it says.
Man, this is
That's
just what
not
it
the true
says.
interpretation of this.
So then they that are in the flesh
Hey, hold on.
cannot
You
please God.
don't even believe verse 9 in the first place. So I don't even know why you're going to this verse 9, because you don't even think the Spirit of God dwells in you.
I have the Spirit of God dwelling in me, yes. It's just not like what you say. So then they that are in the flesh cannot please God. You can't have a good conscience walking out here in the flesh.
That's what I said.
So a person's
I
lost
agree
then.
with you.
So a person's lost.
No, that's not what it's saying.
That is what it says.
I
They
am
live,
carnal.
so then
I-
they that are in the flesh cannot please God. You're out here walking in the flesh, you're not walking in the Spirit. How can you have a good conscience?
You can't. I didn't say you could.
So then what does that mean? If you don't have a good conscience, what does that mean? You are none of his, right?
No, that's not what it means.
That's what Paul says right here.
It does not say if you don't have a good conscience. It says if a man does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his.
If a person doesn't have the Spirit of Christ, what will they be doing, Mr. Adams? Are they going to be walking after the Spirit if they don't have the Spirit of Christ? They're going to be walking in the flesh.
Absolutely.
Okay, they're going to be walking in the flesh. And what does he say about that? None of his.
I just think you're twisting that
Well, that's fine. If you don't have, I mean, hey, I would say go back and study it.
What do you say about? You haven't answered my question. Though.
I did.
Paul said he was carnal. Was Paul unsaved?
Me being in the flesh and me walking after the flesh is not the same.
Oh, okay. But what does carnal say though? He says, "I am carnal," so I understand. What did Apostle Paul mean then?
Yeah, I'm a carnal being. I'm a human person, human being, who sold under sin. The natural response, what is it that I'm owed? I'm owed death and punishment. But when a person obeys, but notice, now hold on. When a person obeys, what are they no longer doing? They're no longer walking after those things, because a person that's walking after the flesh cannot please God.
So was Paul unsaved? He said, "I am carnal. For that which I do, I allow not. That I would, I do not. But that what I hate, that do I."
Okay, and that's exactly
Is he
right.
unsaved?
No, he still is a saved person because he's not walking in the flesh. He's warring with he's warring with the flesh, Romans chapter 7. He's not walking in it. What we're
I am carnal.
Yeah, I'm carnal too. You see this? This is temporal, this is carnal, this is fleshly. But just because I'm fleshly does not mean that I'm walking in the flesh. You see, you need to deal with the terms, and you need to deal with what Paul's dealing with in context.
My friend, it's the same context.
No, it's not. For Paul to say that I'm carnal, that I'm a fleshly person, does not then necessitate that, okay, because I'm a fleshly person, I must walk in the flesh, walk after fleshly things. No, I can be in the flesh. Obviously, I'm in the flesh, and obviously Paul was in the flesh. So when he's discussing, but you're not in the flesh, what's he discussing? He's not talking about this physical body anymore. He's talking about being out there in the world. If Paul is not in the flesh right here, carnal, if he's not in the flesh right here, then where is he? Does he already have his rejuvenated body? What body is he?
You just contradicted yourself.
No, I didn't.
Are you saying Paul was in the flesh, not walking after the flesh?
That's right. Paul is walking after the Spirit. Paul is walking after the Spirit while in his fleshly body.
Look at verse 9. You're not in the flesh.
Okay, so you explain to me where Paul is right
you
here.
are missing terms now.
No, you explain. You explain that
Paul's
then.
in the flesh, but he's not walking out. It's the same thing.
So where is Paul if he's not in the flesh?
This is not talking about in a body, my friend.
This is when he's discussing.
It's not.
When he's discussing in Romans chapter 7, I'm carnal. Yeah, I'm fleshly. But when he get over here to chapter 8, he's no longer talking about that anymore. Because if he's
Seriously, how do you come to that conclusion?
Because he says, if ye are not in the flesh, do we put off this fleshly body when we become a Christian?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. I want you to make your point so I can make my point very clear.
All right, so when Paul is saying, but ye are not in the flesh, does a person put off their flesh? Have I stepped out of my flesh body and put on something different?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so what is it that we're talking about?
Exactly what I think he was talking about the whole time.
What is that?
Walking in the flesh, not walking after the Spirit.
Which would be walking after worldliness, right? Carnality.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's
Paul said, "I am carnal."
all right, but you see there again, he's not talking about this.
Do I?
He's not talking about this. You think Paul was out here walking in carnal things when he's discussing Romans chapter 7?
He said that, but what I hate, that do I.
And how does he?
If I do that which I would not, I can sin and so that is good.
Okay, and how does he?
And it is no more that I do it, but sin that dwelleth in me.
And how does he?
Sin is still dwelling in the Apostle Paul.
How does he describe that? Does he describe that as a walking in the flesh, or does he not describe that in a different way?
He said it as walking in the flesh.
No, he says he wars. He says there is a war.
After he gets done talking in Romans chapter 7.
He says there's a
You
war.
trying to change it because just improve your false doctrine, my friend. But
He
keep
says
it in context.
he says that he is in
That's what
a
I said it was.
he says that he's in a war. Now, if what you're saying is true, then the Apostle Paul would be lost.
No, I would not, because I said there can be carnal Christians.
Not according to what Paul says.
According to you, the Apostle Paul is lost.
Look at what he
He didn't
says.
say there's no such thing as carnal Christian, but Apostle Paul said, I am carnal.
Okay, so
Born
Paul,
under sin.
so Paul's carnal. He's in the flesh. What does that mean?
What does that mean? It means,
Right here in verse 8. So then they that are in the flesh, like Paul, what about Paul?
cannot please God.
So he's a lost person.
According to you. That's not my
No,
interpretation. That's
I don't
your
take-
interpretation.
I do
And
not
I'm glad
take-
you understand your interpretation now.
I do not take
Your
your...
interpretation doesn't match up.
Oh, man.
Your interpretation contradicts.
Okay, well, I'm at 10 o'clock. I didn't realize it. Sorry about that in the control room. If
all
you
good.
if you want to stick around while I pack up, I can put you on hold. It's just whatever you like to do, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. So, didn't get. Oh, we got into our material, and I appreciate the call, but I mean, ladies and gentlemen, are you catching that? If we're not going to be careful with our terms, where Paul says, I'm carnal, I'm flesh, and then we get over, that's Romans chapter 7, we get over to Romans chapter 8, and then he then says, they that are in the flesh cannot please God. Verse 9 says, those that are in the flesh have not the Spirit of God and are not Christ. If Paul is talking about the same thing, then he has just said about himself, he doesn't even belong to Christ. Now, is that what we're going to do? We're not going to do that. He's discussing two separate things. And as I mentioned, we're just, we are out of time. So tune in for our next broadcast, Wednesday nights, 9 p.m., Thursday nights, 8 p.m. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, The Buzz. Caleb will be on dealing with a free speech issue. Thank you for watching, and tune in next time. Thank you.